Hello, and welcome to the History of the Railways, a podcast with the ridiculous goal of telling the story of the railways across the world. Season 1, Episode 2, Motive Power to about 1825. Contrary to popular opinion, rocket was not the first locomotive in Britain. In fact, Jack Simmons, in his The Railways of Britain, reckons it was about the 70th, although he based that number on Marshall's 1938 list, and recent research might make it slightly higher actually. Anyway, the point of this episode isn't to list them all, we're just going to cover the most important milestones. So we'll use a couple of engines to illustrate significant elements of motive power before the Rainhill Trials in 1829. Then we'll cover Rainhill when we talk about the Liverpool and Manchester. So, where to start? Well, not with a loco at all, in fact. By the early 1800s, when most of the developments we'll talk about were taking place, stationary steam engines had been in use for almost a century. Understanding them gives us a good grounding for the basics of locomotive engine, and besides, as winding engines to work inclines, they stayed in use on railways for decades after locos had arrived. So we'll start with them. Thomas Newcomen built the first practical beam engine in 1712. Although it wasn't very efficient, it was a huge improvement on anything that had come before and was widely used to pump water from mines. Like all steam engines since, Newcomen's was a reciprocating engine. That means it generated power through the backwards and forwards movement of a piston. The key difference compared to later engines, though, and the thing to remember when we get to Richard Trevithick, was that it used atmospheric pressure. That means the work was done by the weight of the atmosphere pushing the piston down. There's a link to a neat animation at historyoftherailways.com episode 2, but it is fairly simple to picture, if not actually build. Close your eyes and follow along for a minute, unless you're driving, of course, in which case don't close your eyes. So, imagine a huge beam with a pivot in the middle so it can act as a child's seesaw. One arm of the beam is attached to a pump, the other is attached to the top of a piston, and the piston sits directly above a boiler. The weight on the pump side is heavier than the piston, so when the engine is at rest, the arm on that side will be lower, and on the other arm, the piston will be pulled up, and its cylinder will fill with steam. Now, to make the engine work, some cold water is injected into the cylinder. The cold condenses the steam, making a vacuum inside the cylinder. Because the air pressure on top of the piston is now much bigger than the pressure inside, the piston is forced down. And magic! The other arm is raised, working the pump. Once the pressure is equalised, the cycle begins again. The weight lifts the piston, and the cylinder fills with steam. If you've followed all of that, and you know how modern steam engines work, it's basically the opposite. The work is done by the pressure of the air, not the pressure of the steam. It's more accurately an air engine than a steam engine, which is precisely why they were called atmospheric engines. Now, several people made incremental improvements to the design over the next 50 years or so, but it was James Watt who made the biggest leap in 1765. By adding a separate condenser, he doubled the efficiency of Newcomen's design. And unusually amongst the inventors we'll discuss in this series, he actually made money from it. Although to be fair, that wasn't down to him so much as his business partner Matthew Boulton, but still, well done James Watt. So, Watt greatly improved Newcomen's design, but it was still an atmospheric engine. Boulton and Watt were successful selling their stationary engines with separate condensers by 1775, but 2 years later they employed another man whose impact on locomotives has probably been underestimated. William Murdoch was born in Scotland, and in 1777, when he was 23, he walked the 300 miles from his home to Birmingham just to get a job with Watt. Watt must have been sufficiently impressed with the youngster because he and Boulton continued to work with Murdoch until their deaths. In fact, Murdoch carried on in partnership with their sons, also called rather unimaginatively James Watt and Matthew Boulton, until September 1830, the very same month that the Liverpool and Manchester opened. Murdoch mainly worked on the stationary engines that Boulton and Watt made their money from, but he was an inveterate tinkerer and was constantly at work on some sort of problem or invention. In 1784, while working in Cornwall for Boulton and Watt, he designed and built the first steam-powered locomotive in Britain. In 1769, Nicolas Joseph Cugnot had built a steam-powered carriage for cannons in France. It worked well enough to demonstrate to the army, but they weren't interested, and a year later it was gathering dust in the arsenal. Steam power didn't progress in France until the 1820s, when it was re-kicked off by imports from Britain. Though, to be fair to the French, they probably were a bit busy deposing kings, conquering lots of Europe, and constantly changing their minds about whose heads needed to be chopped off or crowned. Anyway, back in Cornwall, Murdoch's locomotive was a model about a foot tall, had 3 wheels, and was powered by high-pressure steam. It was this last fact that meant that James Watt missed the chance of having an even greater place in history than he does now. He passionately believed that high-pressure steam was dangerous and that boilers couldn't withstand the pressure. And he wasn't totally wrong. There were numerous boiler explosions in the early days, as we'll see. But rather than focus on fixing the problem, Watt told Murdoch to leave it alone and concentrate on the day job. And Murdoch pretty much did as he was told. Although he obviously didn't lose interest altogether, because he demonstrated several of his models over the next 15 or so years to guests at his Red Roof house, including a man who lived right next door to him for a while, Richard Trevithick. From the turn of the 19th century, Trevithick developed several locomotives. He started with road vehicles. His first was Puffing Devil in 1801, which carried passengers on a test run in Camborne in Cornwall on Christmas Eve. But his real contribution was on rails. He designed a rail locomotive for the Coalbrookdale Company in 1802, but there's no record of whether it was ever actually used. By 1804, however, he was at the Penny Darren Ironworks managing a high-pressure stationary engine for Samuel Humphrey. Mr. Humphrey was a big supporter of high-pressure engines generally, and, like Trevithick, he was convinced they could be used to power a practical locomotive. He was so convinced, in fact, that he bet 500 guineas with his neighbour Anthony Hill of the Plymouth Ironworks that a locomotive could haul 10 tons along the plateway from Penny Darren to Abercynon. On the 21st of February 1804, Trevithick's most recent engine did exactly that. In a letter Trevithick wrote the next day to his friend Davies Giddy, who went on to become the president of the Royal Society, he described it like this. Yesterday, we proceeded on our journey with the engine. We carried 10 tons of iron, 5 wagons, and 70 men, riding on them the whole of the journey. It is above 9 miles, which we performed in 4 hours and 5 minutes. We had to cut down some trees and remove some large rocks out of the road. The engine, while working, went nearly 5 miles per hour. No water was put into the boiler from the time we started until we arrived at our journey's end. The coal consumed was 200 weight. On our return home, about 4 miles from the shipping place of the iron, one of the small bolts that fastened the axle to the boiler broke, and all the water ran out of the boiler, which prevented the return of the engine till this evening. The gentleman that bet 500 guineas against it rode the whole of the journey with us, and is satisfied that he has lost the bet. We shall continue to work on the road, and shall take 40 tons the next journey. The public until now called me a scheming fellow, but now their tone is much altered. So success. The first recorded railway journey had taken place. It was a mixed goods and passenger service. Though as an aside, I have seen letters from Humphrey and Trevithick in July that pointed out that the gentleman, Mr. Hill, was still finding excuses not to pay the bet. And while I can't find anything that proves he ever did pay up, it probably fell by the wayside when Humphrey got into a dispute with Hill in November over failing to deliver pig iron that he claimed would have made him £20,000 profit. Anyway, what was the engine like? We don't have any surviving drawings of it, but based on descriptions from the time and a bit of later reasoning, we can safely say the boiler was 6 feet long and 4 feet 3 inches in diameter. There was one cylinder that was 8 inches in diameter and 4.5 feet long, and it was most likely horizontal, contained partially inside the boiler. It probably had a return flue, but it definitely had a blast pipe directing the exhaust into the chimney, something to remember when we discuss the blast pipe controversy later in the series. It was 4-wheeled, and the action of the piston was passed to the wheels via gears on 2 of them rather than directly. The geared wheels were on one side of the boiler. On the other side, there was a large flywheel to smooth the effect of the piston. The drive was interesting enough to lead to a bit of confusion over how you'd apply white notation. I've seen it described as an 040G and a 220. The confusion comes from the fact that the wheels were attached to the axles with a free-moving connection. So while two of them were driven, they didn't pass that drive through the axles to the two on the other side. So it's definitely not an 040. In my opinion, though, it's not really a 220 either, because there were really no leading or trailing wheels as such. What we've got here is a loco that white simply doesn't apply to. Anyway, white aside, all of this resulted in a machine that weighed 5 tons when the boiler was full, and whose top speed was a little under 5 miles an hour. 4 years later, Trevithick also has the honour of running the first paying steam train for the public, although it was really little more than an attempt at advertising. In 1808, in what was then called Torrington Square in London, he ran a specially built engine called the Catch Me Who Can on a circular track 100 feet in diameter. I can't find any records as to what sort of track it was, but his other engines all ran on plateway, so I assume this was the same. He fenced the area off and charged the public £1 each for a ticket to get in. The ticket-buying public could watch the engine circle the track or ride behind it if they were brave enough. Sadly for Trevithick, though, the number of the public who wished to become ticket-buying wasn't big enough to make a profit, and after a couple of months it closed down. Despite the financial failure of the Catch Me Who Can, it did include a couple of marked changes from Trevithick's previous engines that are worth pointing out. Firstly, it did away with the flywheel and the gear wheels. Instead, it used direct crank drive from the cylinder to the driving wheels. Unusually for Trevithick, but more common in the other engines we'll see from here on in, it had a vertical cylinder. A backward step, this one, but it does go to show that a lot of the improvement was down to experimentation. It had a footplate for the driver, and it was clocked by one person who rode behind it, who was in fact a civil engineer himself, so we can probably trust him, at an amazing top speed of 12 miles an hour. Again, something that wouldn't be seen for a while. After that, Trevithick abandoned locomotives altogether, and although he tried a number of other engineering avenues, none of them were financially successful. Eventually, he would leave the UK and spend 11 years in South America trying, and failing, to make his fortune. He returned to the UK for the last years of his life and died penniless in 1827. But that was all in the future, so for now we'll leave Trevithick and London in 1808 and jump 200 miles north. In the same year that the people of the capital were failing to appreciate the Catch Me Who Can, a man named John Blenkinsop became the agent for the Middleton Railway just outside Leeds, and he had a much better view of the potential of the railways than the London public. Even without the work of Blenkinsop and Murray that we're about to discuss, Middleton itself deserves mention in the history of the railways. It was built as a wagonway in 1758, and in most ways it was just another one of the many horse-drawn, wooden-railed wagonways that were set up in the 16 and 1700s that we talked about on the last episode. What earned the Middleton its first place in history was that it was the first to get an Act of Parliament. Until then, the Acts had only been used for canals and toll roads. Given its later conversion to a railway, it's one of the contenders for the title of World's Oldest Railway. And since it was also the first standard gauge line to be reopened as a heritage railway in 1960, that's a claim that it makes good use of on its website today. But back in 1809, the year after Blenkinsop took charge, he started to add cast iron plates to the top of the rails. But he was a forward-thinking man, and that wasn't enough for him. Over the next few years, he started to consider how to use steam power in place of horses. One of the concerns at the time was adhesion, or the ability of the wheels to grip the smooth surface of the rails. We saw earlier that when the wagonways were switching to iron rails, the reduced friction was seen as a good thing. It was easier for horses to pull heavier loads along a smooth iron surface than it was along a wooden one. But, and this is a key secret of early railway technology, horses don't walk on rails. So when steam engines were being introduced, several engineers were concerned that because their wheels would run on the same reduced friction rails as the rolling stock, they'd slip under the heavy loads. It wasn't possible to increase the friction on the drive wheels simply by making the engines heavier, because the rails of the time would have broken, as we've seen. So adhesion was a real problem. Or at least they thought it was. And although we know the outcome of this, it definitely wasn't clear at the time. When we think about how realistic the problem was, it's important to remember all of the railways we're discussing here were already existing mining railways. They could have sections with steep gradients, and they were always dealing with heavy train loads. So you could see why adhesion would be a concern. In any case, John Blenkinsop was particularly worried about this, so in 1811 he patented a rail system he designed to prevent it. His rails were 3 foot long, fish belly, cast iron edge rails with integrated chairs. His innovation was to add 6 semicircular teeth to the outside, forming a rack rail along which a pinion wheel could run. Blenkinsop's patent didn't include the engine itself, only the rack rail, but he made it clear that it was to be used with steam propulsion. Once he'd secured the patent, he got local engineer Matthew Murray to design and build an engine with a pinion wheel, which would engage with the rack. And while Murray built it, he set about replacing one side of the track at Middleton with his new rail. On the 24th of June 1812, the first of Murray's new engines was working the line. Murray built 4 engines for Middleton in fairly short order, and there seems to be some confusion over the name of the first one. I've read some sources that say it was Prince Regent, but most say it was Salamanca. But if it was called Salamanca on the 24th of June, then Murray must have been clairvoyant, because Wellington's famous victory at Salamanca didn't take place until the next month. It's possible that reports got mixed up and the engine was the Prince Regent, but given how many sources claim it was Salamanca, there is another option that strikes me. Although the line was working from the end of June, there was actually a formal opening on the 12th of August. By that time, the news of Wellington's victory was very much in the air. If Blenkinsop and Murray held off naming one until the formal opening, then it could well be that the first engine to run the line in June was indeed christened Salamanca 6 weeks after its debut. Anyway, there's no way to know for sure, and in truth, for our purposes, it doesn't really matter. All 4 of the engines seem to have been built to about the same design. Murray paid Trevithick a fee to use his patented high-pressure steam, and even a casual glance at images of his engines will show the similarities to Trevithick's designs. However, he did introduce some important differences. Murray's designs were 6-wheelers, distributing the weight more than Trevithick's 4-wheeled designs had. They had an inside frame made of 2 large wooden beams running the length of the loco. They had 2 cylinders, which were either 8 inches in diameter by 20 inches long, or 9 by 22. Reports differ about this as well. The pistons were connected to 2 geared wheels by cranks set at right angles to each other. The gears were held under the boiler within the frame, and they in turn drove a 3rd gear, which was fixed via a shaft to the pinion wheel. The pinion wheel itself was 3 feet in diameter and had 20 teeth, and these teeth engaged with the rack on the outside of the rail and produced the drive. Blenkinsop said that they would pull 27 fully loaded wagons, that's probably about 95 tons, at a speed of about 3.5 miles an hour. You'll notice that I called them 6-wheelers instead of giving the white wheel description. The reason for that is the same as Trevithick's earlier design. The drive was only on one side, leading to an odd thought. Does that make these engines the world's only 213s? Anyway, 6-wheelers, and I promise very soon we'll be able to start using white properly. Although the rack and pinion system fairly quickly proved unnecessary, except on mountain railways, a couple of Murray's innovations were adopted on later engines and became standard. Frames were obviously a better idea than mounting to the boiler as Trevithick had, but the most important thing he introduced were offset cranks. Having 2 cylinders and cranks at 90 degrees to each other meant that the engine was able to start from any position. Over the next couple of years, a number of other engineers started to experiment with locomotives. Most followed the same basic approach, though some did have minor variations, not all of which were actually improvements. Between 1811 or 1812 and 1814, William Hedley and Timothy Hackworth built a series of locos at Wylam Colliery in Northumberland. Wylam was owned by Christopher Blackett, who had been intrigued by steam traction from the very early days. As early as 1805, only 1 year after Penny Darren, he'd ordered a locomotive from Trevithick. The engine had been built by Trevithick's agent in the north and tested on the line, but it had not been a success, probably because Wylam at that date still had wooden rails. But Blackett didn't give up on steam though, and 3 years later he instructed Headley to start replacing the rails with iron plate. And at around the same time, he wrote again to Trevithick and asked for another locomotive to work the now improved rails. This was 1808 though, and as we've seen, Trevithick had abandoned railways after the poor response to Catch Me Who Can in London. He refused, writing to Blackett to say that he had discontinued the business, was engaged in other pursuits, and could render no assistance. But Blackett wouldn't be dissuaded. If Trevithick wouldn't help him, then he'd get his own men on the case. He set Headley and Hackworth the task of creating an engine themselves, and they did exactly that. Headley was aware of Blenkinsop and Murray's rack locos and the concerns about adhesion that were in the air, and he carried out an experiment to resolve the question. I find it odd that nobody seems to have considered this already resolved by Trevithick's repeated demonstrations, but for whatever reason they didn't. So anyway, Headley built a frame with wheels coupled by gears. The power came from 4 men riding the frame and turning crankshafts connected to the gear train. This setup meant that he could add various weights to the frame to simulate different weights of locomotive and attach an increasing number of loaded wagons to the rear. The idea being to see how often it would slip and what weight of engine would stop it happening. The test was a success, proving to his own satisfaction that a locomotive could pull a useful load through adhesion alone. It seems that Headley and Hackworth then attached a single-cylinder engine to the frame to make an early prototype loco. Some later records say that this prototype was called Grasshopper, but I can't find any contemporary source that uses that name. Since the term Grasshopper was later applied to all beam engines that pivoted at the end instead of the middle, which all of these Wylam engines did, I'm pretty sure the prototype was never actually named, and someone's misunderstood something after the fact. Then again, I can't find out what the name of the men who had to turn the handles on the first experiment were called either, and they probably did have names. But while the prototype was effective enough to prove the idea was worth pursuing, the engine itself wasn't reliable enough to do actual work and was broken up. By the end of 1813, Headley and Hackworth had got a working version of their engine finished. It was named Puffing Billy, and today it's the world's oldest surviving locomotive. A year later they made another, Wylam Dilly, which also survives, followed by a third in 1817, Lady Mary. Now, having spent the last couple of minutes telling you all about that, I'm going to go out on a limb. In my opinion, if these engines had not survived, we probably wouldn't be talking about them nearly as much. I mean, they were perfectly decent machines, and Hackworth definitely hasn't received the attention he deserves, something I'll do my bit towards fixing as we continue through the series. But there wasn't anything particularly new about the Wylam engines themselves. Puffing Billy has had several claims made for it. It was the first loco with coupled wheels, the first to demonstrate adhesion, the first commercially successful loco. But as we've already seen, every one of those things had already been accomplished by a previous engine that Headley and Hackworth were familiar with. The first engines Trevithick made had wheels coupled together using gears, just like Puffing Billy. Similarly, the experiments to prove adhesion only really reproved something that Trevithick had already shown. And as to the commercial success, well, despite the rack and pinion not being necessary, they were definitely commercially viable. Blenkinsop sold them to other railways, and they remained in use for about 20 years. However, the Wylam engines did have 3 important impacts as far as I'm concerned. Firstly, they helped inspire George Stephenson, who we'll get to in a minute after a brief diversion. And secondly, they got Timothy Hackworth started in engine design. Hackworth would go on to be one of the most important loco engineers of the next few decades, and without the formative time at Wylam, who knows what path he might have followed. Finally, and more generally, the Wylam engines became successful locos that worked the line for decades, albeit with changes in wheel configuration. So they helped build a groundswell of confidence that locomotives were actually a practical transport solution. Okay, before we finish the episode with a look at the engines of George Stephenson from around this time, I promised you a diversion. The steam horse. In 1813, William Brunton came up with what he thought was the perfect solution to the adhesion problem: steam-powered legs. Brunton worked for the Butterley Company in Derbyshire, which had been set up in 1790 by Benjamin Outram. Outram had been a key engineer in the canals and early tramways, and if we'd started our story a little earlier, he'd definitely warrant more attention. But by the time Brunton joined the firm, Outram had already died. The company was still going strong, however, and one of its properties was Limestone Quarry at Critch, which had a tramway. It was here that Brunton, already a successful engineer who'd learnt his trade with Bolton and Watt in Birmingham, tried his hand at locomotives. In May 1813, he patented what he called a mechanical traveller, an engine which in most respects was typical for the time. It had a single horizontal cylinder, 6 inches by 24, which was recessed in a boiler 5.5 foot long and 3 foot in diameter. It was a four-wheeler, but as so often through this episode, white doesn't apply. In this case, though, it really doesn't apply. None of the wheels were driving wheels. Instead, the cylinder powered a pair of mechanical legs at the back of the engine, which pushed the engine along. You can see a picture at historyoftherailways.com, but for now, just imagine the standard engine of the time: a short wooden boiler sitting on a frame supported by 4 wheels with a long sweeping chimney at the front. Now, stick 2 spindly legs on the rear that look as though they belong on the aliens from H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds. Got it? Great. The legs fitted between the rails of the plateway, and Brunton even designed different feet to allow it to walk on a variety of surfaces without damaging them. Although it looked crazy, and it seems unbelievable to us now, the engine seems to have been relatively successful. It travelled at 2 to 3 miles an hour, which was slightly slower than average for the time, but not noticeably so. Robert Young wrote in 1923 that the engine never travelled very far, but he doesn't declare any evidence for that, and there's at least one piece of evidence to the contrary. In 1815, New Bottle Colliery in County Durham had a similar walking engine with a larger boiler, which a Liverpool Mercury reporter described as being expected to pull 10 or 12 wagons. So either this was the first engine getting a new boiler 2 years later, which means it's been working in the meantime, or the first one had been successful enough to make a copy. Unfortunately, we know of the New Bottle engine because on the 23rd of July 1815, the engine driver climbed on top of the boiler and loosened the safety valve. He was hoping to get better speed from it to impress the crowd of people watching. 57 of them ended up being killed or wounded when it exploded. After that, we don't hear of the mechanical traveller again. Not the most amusing of endings, but I said it would be a diversion. I didn't say it would end well. So, that brings us to George Stephenson. In 1814, with Puffing Billy at Wylam, Salamanca at Middleton, and the mechanical traveller plodding between the tram plates of Critch, George Stephenson, who was then the engine wright at Killingworth Colliery, started thinking about how to build his own locomotive. George Stephenson obviously deserves his own episode where we'll dive into some of the controversies surrounding what he does and doesn't deserve credit for. So for now, we're just going to concentrate on his early engines without touching on biographical details or arguments over who deserves priority for various inventions. So in 1814, Stephenson convinced Sir Thomas Liddell, the owner of the colliery, to let him build a locomotive. For the most part, he based his design on Murray's, but he didn't use the rack and pinion wheel, and he made some further minor changes. The result was Stephenson's first loco. It was an 040 engine with 2 8-inch by 24-inch cylinders, a boiler 8 feet 34 inches long, through which a single flue travelled to the chimney. Power was passed from the pistons to the wheels via gears held within the frame. This engine has been described as clumsy, cumbersome and less than impressive, but it appears to have been relatively successful. It ran for the first time on the 27th of July, 1814, and was able to pull 8 wagons weighing 30 tons at a speed of 4 miles an hour. The engine is usually referred to as Blucher, presumably after the Prussian general who had defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Leipzig. Although alternative explanations for the name have been given, including the use of Northumbrian dialectal words for tool or dragon, the reference to the Prussian general seems most likely to me. Remember that one of Murray's successful engines, with which Stephenson was very familiar, was named Salamanca after the battle against the French. By July 1814, when Stephenson was debuting his new engine, The Battle of Salamanca was a dim memory. The Battle of Leipzig, that made Blucher famous on the other hand, had only taken place the year before. And unlike Salamanca, it led directly to Napoleon's defeat. In fact, the French Emperor had only abdicated and been exiled to Elba 3 months before Stephenson's engine was first run. If you wanted the world to take notice of your new engine and subtly suggest how much better it was than the competition, how satisfying would it be to name it after one of the leaders of the most decisive battles in living memory? You know, Blucher, like Salamanca, only better. Of course, nobody knew in July 1814 that less than a year later Napoleon would return from Elba and there'd be another 3 months of bloody fighting before it was really over. Anyway, all that to one side, above all else, Blucher enabled Stephenson to identify things that he needed to improve. And in particular, in 1815, he filed another patent that removed the gears passing drive to the wheels and replaced them with a direct drive ball and socket joint. This patent also introduced a feature of the next few Stephenson engines, coupled wheels, although these were coupled by chains rather than rods. Between 1815 and 1825, the number of locomotives throughout the country crept up, but not as quickly as we'd expect with the benefit of hindsight. We know where the story's going, and so it seems odd that there would be a time when progress stalled, but in truth that's pretty much what happened. Lots more railways were opened, or proposed, but there was far from a universal expectation that a railway needed a steam locomotive. The benefits of rails had been proven, but for most people, the jury was still out on the new machines to run along them. And at the same time, loco development slowed down. So by the early 1820s, the state of the art had settled into an engine that, albeit with some exceptions, looked broadly like this. 4 wheels running on edge rails. More wheels was only seen as necessary to distribute weight for plateways. 2 vertical cylinders driving the wheels directly. Coupled drive wheels, although that coupling might be via gears or chains. Boilers of a variety of sizes with either single or return flues. Locomotives had become fairly robust, but it wasn't completely clear that they were living up to the promise of the early believers. Both practically and financially, horsepower still looked like a viable option. But if you join me on the next episode, I'll be talking about the Stockton and Darlington Railway, the railway that started to shift wider opinion and began to prove the naysayers wrong. If you're enjoying the show, please like, subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, you can find relevant images and links to the source material I used for research on historyoftherailways.com, where you'll also find ways to support the show. If you want to get in touch, then just drop me a line at michael@historyoftherailways.com or follow us on Facebook and join the conversation there. So tell your friends to come and join us on the next episode as we get distracted, fascinated and yes, even sidetracked by the stories from the history of the railways.